Our breaking news coverage continues right now at 7 o'clock. Ex-NFL star Aaron Hernandez found hanged in his prison cell in Shirley overnight. Prison officials saying that he committed suicide.
Yeah, so apparently this happened around 3:05. That's when he was discovered very early this morning. This is the corrections facility in Shirley. We do know, according to the statement that was provided to us from the corrections center and in the DOC, that life-saving techniques were attempted on him, that he was transported to UMass in Leominster. He was pronounced dead about an hour later, 4:07, very early this morning. And we started getting word of it roughly 45 minutes ago here within our newsroom. Apparently hanging himself with a bed sheet that he attached to his cell window, and apparently also, according to this report, blocking the door so that guards and so forth could not gain entrance to his jail cell.
Right, and we do know that Mass State Police are at that jail right now in Shirley. They're investigating. They say that his family has been notified of his death. And again, this is coming just days after he was acquitted of that double murder back in 2012. So still a lot of developments. And, you know, one thing we never heard from his defense team was about Hernandez's state of mind. But we also never heard that while he was in jail, either in Shirley or his initial time while he was awaiting trial for the trial of Odin Lloyd, whether or not he had been put on any sort of suicide watch or how his demeanor was. And, you know, the sheriff there saying that he felt like Hernandez fit into prison, that he knew how to use his charm to get what he wanted. So,
in fact, going as far as to say, I mean, we had just done a story about this a few days back, that Sheriff Thomas Hodgson had called him a master manipulator. He went as far as to say that, and a sociopath. He was very blunt about his kind of his interactions with Hernandez and what he thought of his personality profile.
And as you had mentioned, saying that he thought that he had, you know, that he was a sociopath, that maybe he was sort of disconnected, that he really didn't feel as if he was guilty or had any association with anything that was going on. I'm told that we have Sky 7 now over the scene of the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center in Shirley.
Right, so this is what's considered to be one of the maximum security prisons here in the Commonwealth. It's run by the state, the Department of Corrections, Shirley, located out in north central Massachusetts, and that's where he has been ever since that verdict came down roughly, what is it now, since Friday.
Yes.
So we're talking just a handful of days here since that verdict came down. And clearly, you know, I know for some people it was a shock. We do know, of course, he had his high-profile attorney, Jose Baez, as part of his legal team. So in that sense, he was able to infuse enough doubt in people's minds as to who to believe. Do you believe the prosecution, the state's witness who cut a deal? Do you believe Aaron Hernandez's story? We never saw him taking the stand in his own defense, either in this particular case or the murder, the first-degree murder that he was convicted of a couple of years ago in the case of Odin Lloyd.
And covering that trial, 7's Byron Barnett was there since the beginning, and Byron's joining us now on the phone with more. Obviously, I have to imagine you're surprised by these latest developments.
No, absolutely. Who wouldn't be? I mean, Aaron Hernandez was acquitted in a high-profile, a double murder trial 2 years after he was found guilty of another murder. This should have been one of the happiest moments of his life. One can only wonder what goes through his mind. You know, you were just talking about Jose Baez and the trial, and just the big picture of that trial. Well, Jose Baez, I have to admit, the prosecution did a good job too. They did the best with what they could, but Jose Baez, as a defense attorney, their team really did a masterful job. Here's a situation: you had two individuals, Aaron Hernandez and his friend, former friend Alexander Bradley, the only two individuals who were there that night and saw each other, who could identify each other as being at the scene. Nobody else was around. The people who were around were deceased, shot dead, or had run away. The two of them pointing fingers at each other, saying the other guy did it. This is one thing that was significantly different than the Odin Lloyd trial. The Odin Lloyd trial, you had a situation where there was no motive provided for anything. They never found a murder weapon. The prosecution was able to essentially use a lot of security cameras on streets and in Aaron Hernandez's home. He had 32 security cameras inside his house, and also phone records, so they could account for every moment of his time. And the defense really had not too much, that really didn't have anything to add. That they didn't put Aaron on the stand, and so he ended up being convicted. In this case, the second trial, Jose Baez started right off the bat with a counter theory. The prosecution said that Aaron Hernandez was a guy who got irritated with people coming up to him in public sometimes, and that he'd go to these clubs, particularly on Sunday nights. That's when a lot of the celebrities go, I guess, because it's sort of quieter. And that one of the victims, Daniel de Abreu, allegedly danced over to him, bumped into Aaron, and spilled a drink on him. And that's what angered Aaron. And according to the prosecution, Aaron Hernandez, just a couple of hours later, saw them outside, followed after them in a car with Alexander Bradley driving, and then reached over Alexander Bradley and shot these men as they were sitting at a stop at a red light. A few months later, the prosecution alleges that Aaron Hernandez went to Florida with Alexander Bradley and shot Alexander Bradley in the face, putting one of his eyes out because he was paranoid that he might be talking about the murder, the double murder back there. Well, from the first day of the trial, the defense attorney, Jose Baez, put a completely different theory out there. He says that he told the jurors, that the prosecution made a deal with the devil. He said it wasn't Aaron Hernandez who shot these two men. It was Alexander Bradley. And Alexander Bradley is an admitted drug dealer, and he said that he was all over a drug deal with one of the victims, which the prosecution adamantly denies. And he says that Alexander Bradley was shot in the face months later by a drug dealer down in Florida. So this is what the jury was left to deal with. And one has to wonder, nobody knows what was going on in the jury room, or the jurors said they based their decision on the evidence and the law. But one has to wonder, perhaps maybe they just couldn't decide which one of the two pulled the trigger, and maybe that was enough reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. We really don't know. But at any rate, again, this should have been one of the happiest days of Aaron Hernandez's life. He and Cheyenne exchanged looks, warm looks. He said he mouthed "I love you" to her. The last day of the trial, he was crying. We assumed tears of joy. She was crying tears of joy. There were a lot of other, obviously, tearful relatives of victims who were crying not out of joy, but just out of pure anguish. But looking at the two of them, you had to think, well, maybe there was a little bit of hope. He does have an appeal coming up, so perhaps Cheyenne Jenkins. She told us she was very happy that day. She was very happy. Aaron Hernandez and Cheyenne Jenkins.
Byron.
Her name is.
Byron,
her name is.
I hate to interrupt.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I hate to interrupt you because obviously you're giving us such great information. But on the phone right now we have Steve Diassi, former linebacker with the Patriots. And Steve, just want to ask, what went wrong here? You had a rising star. He was signed to the Patriots, a championship team. These murders were, the murder he was convicted of happened while he was playing with the Pats. The double murder that he was just acquitted of happened during his time with the Pats. What happened?
It's hard to pinpoint any one thing. There's any number of reasons, from the way you were brought up, the atmosphere you grew up in, the whole idea that you were. It seemed like you wanted to be the king of the thugs. It just you've seen a lot of guys that have left that behind. There's been any number of guys in any professional sports, football, basketball, whatever, that have had those type of upbringings, but have been able to leave it behind. Apparently, Aaron Hernandez could never leave it behind, and brought it with him at the University of Florida, from what I understand, and at the New England Patriots, and that lifestyle usually claims victims on all sides.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to fathom, Steve. 7-year, $40 million contract, nearly $2 million home, all of that gone. So
yeah, it's amazing. The idea that you have such a wonderful opportunity, and you have a child, a daughter that benefits from all the hard work you did to get there. It's amazing that you could throw all that away.
not to mention a 4-year-old daughter as well.
Yep.
So what kind of signs were pointing to what Aaron Hernandez was all about prior to his time playing professionally for the NFL? We do know through reading that his time was rather tumultuous when he was in Florida, playing at the University of Florida, profiled as someone extremely explosive in his personality traits, sensitive to the point that it was really undercutting what he was capable of doing on the field. What were the signs?
Well, there's any number of things. The first thing is that you didn't cut the ties and the strings from your old neighborhood or from your old gang activities. It came with them to Florida. There was also talk of gun activity when he was at the University of Florida, and then when he came to the Patriots, there was still an influx of guys from the old neighborhood or guys that he started associating with in the Boston area. There was all sorts of issues, and there were issues in the locker room. There were any number of reports in the locker room where there was physical confrontations with other players. But and the idea that there were guys, there were reports of players trying to get him out of the area to go work out in California with some of the other receivers and quarterbacks and whatnot. There was all sorts of talk about trying to give him the opportunities that he wasn't taking for himself. And the biggest part of that was not giving up on that thug life that he was raised in. And there were efforts. There were efforts in college. There were efforts both from the team and from his teammates at the Patriots. And none of it took. None of it stuck with the kid.
Right. What the efforts that you're talking of? I mean, it sounds kind of less organized. You know, just kind of guys pitching together, seeing somebody who was in trouble, wanting to help out for the sake of the team, but nothing organized, nothing at an organizational level.
You just don't know. The Patriots won't talk about that, but you see it all the time. You saw it in my days in the NFL, where you see a guy doing things that were detrimental not just to himself, but to his family and his teammates and whatnot. And there would be, would be intervention with guys. Guys would, on the team would step in and talk and ask about what's going on and try to set the kid on the right path. I'm not sure how much of that happened with the Patriots, but I know it was like you said, tumultuous, and there were signs, but I don't think no matter what signs that you have, I don't think anybody could extrapolate murder out of those signs. It was one of those things where it was just craziness all around.
You know, you can take this story in a variety of different ways. I mean, clearly it's, on one end, you know, it's about one man and one player and the choices that he made in his life, and a chain of events that unfolded that were tragic on so many levels. But what also can be learned from an organizational standpoint to prevent something like this from happening again? Someone so high profile, emboldened perhaps by his success, and bringing down so many other lives in the process.
Well, I think the first thing teams can do is not be tentative about these things. If there's signs, if there's indications, if there's anything that points in those directions. And we've seen it. We've seen teams be more proactive over the last 4 or 5 years about not wanting to or at least trying to get help for some of these guys, and then also avoiding some of those situations. We see it every year in the draft. We've seen it this year in the draft. There's a number of guys with blemishes on their record, and at one degree or another, and teams are going to shy away from them. And but once that person's in the team scenario, there's not a lot teams can do other than try to offer him scenarios that could get him help. You can't force a guy to get help. You can't mandate it. You can't really put it in the contract that someone's going to seek help for various types of behavior. But I think teams are going to do a combination of trying to avoid having those guys on the team and to offer up whatever counseling or whatever services the NFL and the teams have to offer.
Right.
Steve, thank you so much. And now we want to head out to 7's Steve Cooper, who's also live on the phone. And Steve, again, just to bring anyone up to date who's just joining in, according to the Department of Corrections, they say they found Aaron Hernandez hanging by a bed sheet that was tied to his jail cell window at 3:05. They tried to save him. They brought him to the hospital. He was pronounced dead at 4:07 a.m. This is someone who just days ago was acquitted of a double murder.
Okay, apparently Steve isn't plugged in, but hopefully we'll be getting back to him.
Krista, I can hear you.
Okay, go for it, Steve. So what are you hearing right now?
Well, again, according to my sources this morning, state police are now involved in the investigation here, just to make sure that everything that we're hearing actually happened the way that it did. And obviously, because this is a high-profile case, state troopers went to the hospital, Leominster Hospital, where Aaron Hernandez was taken and pronounced dead. And so now what will happen here is investigators with their CPAC unit, crime scene investigators, will go back to the cell and take a closer look at some of the things that we're hearing this morning about the fact that he had jammed some items in the door of his cell to perhaps block correctional officers once they found him from coming in. And then just a couple of other things that they'll be doing. An autopsy will be performed, and investigators are just anxious or want to make sure it doesn't come back with that there were any sort of toxins in his body or anything like that. And clearly, it's unknown whether this was something that Aaron Hernandez had planned out, or it was something that just happened spontaneously. But they'll sort of try to piece the last several hours together, if not the past several days, since he was brought back to Sousa Baranowski after he was acquitted of that double murder. They're just going to look back and sort of follow, who he perhaps had talked to over the past few days, what inmates he interacted with. And also they'll be looking at when the correctional officers last checked on him. As you know, he was in general population, but he was in a single cell. And according to my sources, he wasn't on any sort of a suicide watch. A suicide watch would include, inside even a maximum security prison in the state, it would include 24-hour, around-the-clock surveillance through cameras of watching the inmate. But in this case, he wasn't on any sort of a suicide watch, but they would want to just look back and see, when the last time he was out in general population. Don't forget that in these prisons here in Massachusetts, they have, multiple, if not hundreds of cameras, facing in every direction. So they'll be able to look back and see what his day was like yesterday, who he was interacting with, maybe talk to some of those inmates to see if there was any indication of why. The investigators that I talked to this morning basically said they're as baffled as everybody else, mainly because he beat that double murder rap last week. And if anything, they felt, and they even used the word concerned, that there was a possibility through an appeal that this is an inmate who may have, beat the rap and been out. So they were, concerned, or certainly watching what had happened last week and how it transpired. And I think what these investigators are saying is they're even baffled that why would someone who beat a double murder rap, what would take them to this point? They did say that, don't forget Aaron Hernandez, he was still going to be facing multiple, a civil suit in the case that had been filed, which would have required, more time in the courtroom. The appeal process, I mean, his time in courtrooms was far from over at this point. But interesting to note, after he, beat the rap last week, and you heard it through all levels of law enforcement, here's a guy who, broke down in tears, thankful that he didn't get the double murder there, but knowing full well that he was going back, and he was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, which basically means you die in prison if you don't get an appeal somewhere along the way.
Steve, you were mentioning some of the security there at the Sousa Baranowski. It is maximum security. It is high tech. You know, we were just kind of remembering it was roughly 10 years ago that John Gagan, the pedophile priest, was murdered by Joseph Druce. It was at that same facility, if I remember correctly. Did they, you know, ramp up any kind of security after that and so forth that you're aware of?
No, they didn't. And keep in mind, Sousa Baranowski was where they had that riot. I think it was a few months ago that we covered over there. And you probably remember, you know, the Department of Corrections released the first pictures of the inmates rioting, and then released video from many different cameras in multiple directions. So, you know, talk about transparency. The Massachusetts, you know, Correctional Department, you know, they want to make sure, as secret and as secure as these facilities are, they want to make sure that the public, you know, sees what they're seeing and what they're dealing with. And when you talk about things like suicides in prison, there are, you know, we've covered murders in prison. One inmate kills another. And, you know, so we've covered those. But when it comes to, you know, suicides, you know, these inmates, they're in there 24/7. There's times that they're out of their cell, but there's an awful lot of times that they're in their cell by themselves. And when one person who is sentenced to die in prison spends a lot of time in their cell by themselves, these investigators and correctional officers and the wardens know this, the superintendents, that, you know, these people have a lot of time to spend in there. And, you know, keep in mind the correctional officers, you know, they're in charge of the whole facility. They're in charge of all the prisoners. They're in charge of the general population. And unless, as I said, someone's on a suicide watch, which would require special measures of a unit where these correctional officers are supposed to be watching them 24/7, you know, you have a lot of time. There's a lot of time that people aren't watching these guys. And so they have this amount of time. So when you mention about Gagan or others, you know, we don't cover all the suicides that happen in Massachusetts prisons, hangings or whatever. We don't cover them all, but in the high-profile cases we do, like today. And I think what's more shocking to most of the investigators is that here's a guy who just a few days ago beat a double murder rap. Now, again, that would have put him in prison for the rest of his natural life on the murder one, on the first one, on the Odin Lloyd case, and then he would have had 2 additional ones on top of that. So the fact that he beat them and he was sentenced to 4 to 5 years. What was interesting, when he was sentenced to 4 to 5 years on top of his life sentence, as ludicrous as that sounds to people, you know, that's what Judge Locke did. So this was added on to his life sentence. And the reason that he did that was because if he beat the rap or the appeal on the first murder conviction, he still would have had a 4 to 5 year prison sentence hanging over his head.
7 Steve Cooper, they're reporting for us and talking a little bit about the background there at the Sousa Baranowski Corrections Facility run by the state's Department of Corrections, maximum security, high tech. Steve just going into a little bit of detail as to what it means to be in the general population housing unit versus on a suicide watch. Important distinctions to make as we kind of understand the circumstances surrounding the death of Aaron Hernandez, just 27 years old, recently acquitted in a double murder case, a high-profile case being tried here in Boston, and now, as of 3 o'clock this morning, found hanged inside of his prison cell, the door wedged and blocked so that no one could gain entrance. They eventually did. He was rushed to a hospital in Leominster, UMass, and was pronounced dead roughly an hour later. And here we are at 7:23 here on your Wednesday morning, following these stunning developments that have taken place in the early morning hours here. Just once again, just a handful of days after that murder acquittal.
And one thing that Cooper just touched upon is that Mass State Police are investigating. They also went to the hospital where Hernandez was pronounced dead to make sure that what is being reported by the Department of Corrections is in fact what happened. There's nothing saying otherwise, but obviously because it's a high-profile case, they're going to have other agencies getting involved in this because, Krista, as you had mentioned before, just seeing Hernandez's lack of reaction or sort of smug reaction throughout both of these trials, then to see him nearly break down once the jury said not guilty in this double murder trial, and then his defense attorney, Jose Baez, who has never had a client been convicted of first-degree murder, said that they wanted to retry him in this murder case of Odin Lloyd. So, you know, possibly looking at getting an acquittal in the defense's mind, at least. And then days later, Aaron Hernandez found hanged inside of his jail cell. All of this happening as Hernandez's former team is set to head to the White House later today to be congratulated on winning Super Bowl 51 by President Trump. 7's John Coco is live at Gillette. You were covering that angle of it. But, you know, as we mentioned, the Patriots remain tight-lipped about everything, don't react to anything. And it was just last week where Belichick would only describe the situation with Hernandez by saying it's a tragedy.
Yeah, Nicole, that interview that you're talking about, it was on CNBC. The interviewer had asked Bill Belichick a number of questions. They were playing sort of a word association game, and Aaron Hernandez's name came up, and the word that Bill Belichick used was tragedy. The interviewer, followed up by saying heartbreaking. And he said, yeah, that's another word for it. And it sort of sums up this whole situation. It was heartbreaking, you know, before, and of course, it's even more heartbreaking now. And you're right, this was supposed to be a day of celebration for the Patriots, a day where they were going to be honored at the White House by the president. And, you know, there was a lot of talk surrounding this visit of who was going to go to the White House, who wasn't going to the White House. And it all seems sort of minor now when you have this news this morning of Aaron Hernandez killing himself in his cell. You know, just kind of a side note, I put this information out on Twitter as soon as we got it this morning, and sort of as soon as I did that, floods of responses sort of came in. And, you know, Steve talked about investigators being baffled by this, and I think just the general public are also baffled by this. People can't believe that they're hearing about Aaron Hernandez killing himself, especially over the latest news of beating that double murder rap that Cooper was talking about. So, yeah, the Patriots generally tight-lipped about everything. I haven't seen any reaction just yet from the Patriots. Of course, we're looking for that now, but this is supposed to be a day where they were going to be celebrated at the White House for that historic Super Bowl comeback win, and all of that focus has now shifted to a former teammate of theirs, Aaron Hernandez.
All right, 7's John Coco reporting live for us there outside Gillette Stadium, and clearly there will be reaction coming from all angles. I think, you know, most curious clearly is the reaction from the family of Odin Lloyd. I will never leave me, just kind of the reaction of his mother at the end of that trial, the raw emotion, and just the forgiving spirit, it seemed, that she exemplified. I was really kind of struck with that during the first trial, that she seemed to be so willing to kind of leave the past in the past, of course, always knowing that the future will never be the same without her dear son. But, and of course, getting news that the family had intended to file a civil lawsuit against Aaron Hernandez. Again, not knowing where that stands, and wanting to hear one from them, and the reaction obviously from Hernandez's fiance, who has a 4-year-old daughter that she is left to take care of, and we saw her rather prominently in both trials testifying on behalf of the defense. We want to bring in 7's Byron Barnett, because I think one thing that is really striking about all of this is how the interconnectedness, not only with these crimes, you know, one crime kind of to cover up another. That was the allegation put forward by the prosecution. But how tightly wound all of the players in this real-life drama were. The fact that Odin Lloyd's girlfriend was the sister of Aaron Hernandez's fiance.
Krista, you are absolutely right in terms of all of the players in this, from the victims to the relatives and so forth. This is a very interconnected group of family and friends here. If you can try to figure this scenario out here, Aaron Hernandez, longtime fiance, was Shayana Jenkins. Shayana Jenkins has a sister, Shania Jenkins, who was dating Odin Lloyd at the time that Odin Lloyd was murdered by Aaron Hernandez, and you have in the second trial, you have Alexander Bradley, who was a longtime friend of Aaron Hernandez, who was always over at their house all the time, and he ends up being the chief witness against Aaron Hernandez. There were relatives who prosecutors said, hid weapons and the cars and things for Aaron Hernandez. The weapon, the car, they went back to people connected to Aaron Hernandez, but also connected to Alexander Bradley. In that first trial, back to the two sisters, every day in court. Shayana Jenkins, Aaron Hernandez's longtime fiance, would sit on the left side of the court. She sat right in front of me, along with Aaron Hernandez's mother, Terry Hernandez. On the right side of the court, and there's a very small courtroom, sat the Odin Lloyd family, and sitting right next to Ursula Ward, that is Odin Lloyd's mother, his mother was Shania Jenkins at the time. So he had two sisters in the courtroom on opposite sides of this murder case. Both of them testified, and both of them, talked about the strains in their relationship because of this trial. And to this day, I don't know what their relationship is. I don't know if they were been able to get over this or not. That's, I guess, an internal family matter. But you're right. The inner family connections here are unbelievable. One thing that Shania did, she surprised everyone when she took the stand and introduced herself as, Shayana, I'm talking about, introduced herself as Shayana Jenkins Hernandez. So she took Aaron Hernandez's name, and my understanding is that she did that because she wanted their daughter, their 4-year-old daughter, she wanted the two of them to have the same name. I mean, that surprised a lot of people, and I asked her if we were supposed to continue, how she wanted to be referred to, as a girlfriend, a fiance, and she said fiance was fine. She didn't really mind. She didn't care really what we called her. But I mean, you have to wonder. I mean, she's engaged to someone who's going to be in prison for the rest of his life, unless he would be successful on his appeal. But still, she chose to take his name. So that's a little bit about some of these family connections, this tightly wound group here, as you say, Krista.
All right, 7's Byron Burnett on the phone covering this big breaking news story that we've been following now for you for well over an hour. And you are watching 7 News continuing coverage now at 7:30 on this Wednesday morning of the stunning developments from early this morning coming out of north central Massachusetts, out of Shirley, where we are hearing that 27-year-old Aaron Hernandez killed himself early this morning inside of his prison cell.
That's right. According to the Department of Correction, they say they found him at 3:05 in the morning. They say that he hanged himself by tying a bed sheet to his cell window. They also say that Hernandez attempted to block the door from inside by jamming it with several items. He was pronounced dead at 4:07 a.m. by a doctor at UMass Leominster Hospital. We also know state police are also on the scene investigating, according to Steve Cooper, just to make sure that things played out the way that the Department of Corrections is in fact reporting. Right now we have 7's Stan Housley on the phone just reacting to this big breaking news.
Yes, I don't know exactly what I can add to some of what you've talked about, but I find that I think you've touched on an interesting context here. We have some of Aaron, this suicide comes on the day and just hours away from when former teammates of Aaron Hernandez will be at the White House. And Hernandez, had he made other choices in his life, could have been on this path. And this emphasizes, just puts an exclamation point on the tragic life choices here. Byron had just talked about the families who have been impacted by those choices as well, and we can't forget them when we talk about the tragedy and the sadness. It is not for Aaron Hernandez, but for the life that could have been and the life choices and the paths taken. And that tragic tale juxtaposed by teammates so high today in a place that he easily could have been, and instead he's dead in a prison cell. Just a sad and shocking ending to a life that could have easily gone a different way, and just once again causes you to wonder what went on in the head of Aaron Hernandez, not just hours past, but years past, and in his life. You've heard Steve Diassi, who's had some insight into times as a teammate. We've heard over the years things going back about in his family, his loss of his father, and how that, in many people's view, was a turning point in his life, and not in a good way. And so we can try to psychoanalyze, but I think the only possibility of getting close to that is if any people close to him can truly tell us what he said and what he was feeling in times in his life, and particularly in the last hours of his life.
You know, one thing we never really heard the defense talk about, you know, one question that's normally asked at arraignments is, how is your client doing? How is the defendant doing? We never really heard the defense or, you know, Jose Baez really ever talk about the mental state of Aaron Hernandez,
right.
only that he claimed his innocence, said that he, you know, he didn't do it. According to Steve Cooper, his sources say Hernandez wasn't on any sort of suicide watch while he was in Shirley. And when he spent his first months at the Dartmouth jail awaiting the trial for Odin Lloyd, Sheriff Thomas Hodgson there said that it seemed like he fit in jail, that for the first year or so, he was training as if he was going back with the Patriots. So there have been no reports, at least anyways, that Hernandez was having any trouble you know, getting acclimated to life in prison.
True, but yet you think, you know, looking back on some of the reports about Hernandez coming out of, you know, those kind of vulnerable times as a young man, and you have to think that there were some holes maybe in that profile and maybe some missed signs or what have you. That's for anyone to judge, clearly. But yeah, as you were saying, it looked like things were going along as expected there behind the jail cell. But knowing what we know about his past, one would think that there was some, you know, a compromised kind of profile there as well. It's kind of interesting getting people's reaction on Twitter. You know, very broad range of reactions, as you might guess. And this one here from somebody who said, no matter how you feel about Aaron Hernandez, he is still someone's son and brother. Prayers to the family. So one statement from just one, you know, random person on Twitter, but clearly a lot of reaction still to be pouring in as this big breaking news reaches far and wide. This is a nationwide story here. When you're talking about a man who, at the age of 27, has been acquitted of a double murder, has been convicted of another, and at one time lived in a $1 million house and was signed to 7 years and a $40 million contract with a Super Bowl winning team. Someone that you think had everything going for him, a rising star. You had the Hernandez-Gronkowski duo. Yeah, that's right.
You know, people were talking about how unstoppable the Patriots would be. Then when it was coming into question that Aaron Hernandez could be arrested facing charges, they didn't know what. I think Patriots Nation was stunned initially when it was those murder charges that came down. Really, and when you think about this, has been a process now several years, you know, from the initial time that he was taken into custody, and we all remember that, and then the murder trial, and seeing just the pain of Odin Lloyd's mother, Ursula Ward, saying that she forgave, you know, Aaron Hernandez, but yet was so clearly just devastated by the loss of her son. What a good man, too. Remember when we heard so much about him and how he was helping his younger siblings and family out, and just a tragedy on so many levels. And then you have two families most recently. You know, he was found not guilty of the murders of Daniel De Abreu and Safira Furtado, but those are two families who believed the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office when they brought the murder charges against Hernandez, that he was the man that pulled the trigger for no reason other than it stemmed from a spilled drink at the nightclub. And I remember after the verdict was read, Dan Conley saying that what hurt the most was the defense painting those two victims as drug dealers, something that the defense had no evidence of. And, you know, for these poor families to go through this because they truly believed Hernandez was the one that pulled the trigger, that he was guilty. You know, they're going through this as well as Odin Lloyd's family, who went through this years ago with the trial. Right, and reliving it with every major development that will happen from now until the end of time, each anniversary, each holiday that comes up. But it certainly, you know, when you think about just the chance encounter, a spilled drink at a nightclub, you bump into somebody, you know, you're dancing, and but given kind of the information that has come out about Hernandez, that kind of explosive, tumultuous personality, the prosecution clearly thought that was a plausible, you know, prosecution to put on, but in the end it didn't work out for the jury because they acquitted him, could not reach a unanimous verdict. And I think we had been talking about since this broke, he's either been silent or smug, and we've only sort of seen him smile when it's been a former teammate testifying in his defense, Cheyenne Jenkins, his fiance, taking the stand, or when his his daughter, his 4-year-old daughter, was in the courtroom the first day of deliberations. And
blowing kisses.
And Cheyenne said it was okay, to put her on video and he would, look back at her. So to see him break down when this verdict was read, I was very surprised by this, just because there has been no reaction.
Right.
So to see him break down, give his attorneys, that long embrace, see the family's, his fiance's reaction, saying that she was very happy when he was acquitted of the double murder. You would think in his mind going forward, maybe he felt vindicated, and that going forward, Jose Baez said that he thought he could get him acquitted of the murder of Odin Lloyd. So now for the news just to come out just days later that he had hanged himself inside of his cell at the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center and Shirley, I think, really has a lot of people surprised, and I believe Steve Cooper is on the phone. And Steve, you've been talking with your sources about the investigation that's happening right now at the prison.
Right, so just to get everyone caught up to date here, sources say that he wasn't on any sort of a suicide watch, and basically what that means is he was in a single cell in the general population, but correctional officers wouldn't have been watching him 24/7. There was no indication of that, no reason for that. But correctional officers do their walkthroughs. We don't know when that happens, whether they're hourly, overnight, whether they're, something longer than that. But those are the types of things that investigators will now just take a look at. We should emphasize that state police investigators have no reason to believe, no indications in any way that this was anything but a suicide. But just because of this high-profile nature of the case that we're dealing with here, they will take a look at some of those things and talk to inmates and see who Aaron Hernandez spoke with over the past 24 hours and try to see if anybody has any information that would help give the investigators a better understanding of why this happened and when it happened. You can look back, as investigators are doing. Sunday was Easter Sunday. We keep talking about Aaron Hernandez, his wife, and his daughter. We don't know if there were any conversations. Did they have were there visiting hours over the weekend on the holiday? And then, of course, you fast forward to today with his team, his former team, his team that he played for, that he was the big hero on, are now, if not already in Washington, on their way to the White House. And so, you start putting various pieces to the puzzle together and get a little better picture of the last, 24 or 48 hours in the life of Aaron Hernandez. And keep in mind, and, Krista, Nicole, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Aaron Hernandez is or was, probably the highest profile inmate in a Massachusetts correctional facility, if not in decades ever. And I say that in making the point that when you have a high profile person like that, here he was a big superstar football player living in general population. You can imagine what that's like. You talked about when he was being housed down in Dartmouth at the Bristol County House of Corrections. We often talk to Sheriff Hodgson down there about how they were able to integrate him with not just the inmates themselves, but with the correctional officers. I mean, this guy was a celebrity. He was a superstar football player before he was convicted of the murder of Odin Lloyd. And so, you have all that. We often talked about his tattoos. There was a lot of examination of his tattoos. I remember talking to Sheriff Hodgson a while back, and he talked about how they brought in tattoo experts to look at Aaron Hernandez's tattoos and determine if they were gang-related, and if so, what were the gangs that he was connected to, and all critical information when you're trying to keep a high-profile inmate in general population. He was never moved out of general population. In New Hampshire several years ago, Pam Smart was in New Hampshire. She was convicted of murder, but she was eventually moved out of state. She's now serving out her life prison sentence in a prison in upper state New York. But Aaron Hernandez, was never moved out of state. I don't know whether that was they were waiting to see what happened in this second trial, but he has been sentenced on on the first trial to life in prison for the rest of his natural life. And the key is without the possibility of parole, barring a retrial or an appeal that's overturning the case or something like that. So keep in mind that this is a high-profile inmate who day in and day out is dealing with the general population. He was never in isolation that we're aware of. And, yes, he was in a single cell by that, meaning that, overnight he slept in a cell by himself. But during the day, he was out, doing the chores that the inmates are to do, eating with the inmates, interacting with inmates. And, we mentioned at Sousa Baranowski just a few months ago, they had that uprising there, that prison uprising. He wasn't involved in that. That was in a different wing. But there's a whole different culture that's going on behind the scenes in maximum security prisons like the one in Shirley. And so, again, all these things come into play. We saw him for the past couple of months, as Byron mentioned, sitting in the courtroom, maybe a smile to somebody or a look off. I remember, when I would see him in the courtroom, he'd often mouth the words, "I love you" to Cheyenne. Byron mentioned about how she mentioned what her name is now, but we don't know the background. We don't know when they last talked, what they talked about. Did his daughter get on the phone on Easter Sunday and that set him on? We don't know any of those things, but those are the types of things that investigators will look at, as well as I mentioned earlier. But it's worth noting there will be an autopsy conducted, and they want to just make sure. And double make sure here that there were in no way were there any toxins in his body. And you can say, well, how would that happen? Well, it does happen, and they just want to rule everything out before they can conclusively say that this guy just grabbed a bed sheet overnight at 3 o'clock in the morning and hung himself. But he also, jammed the door. So those are two different things if you think about it. A lot of times when someone takes their life, they're not thinking about that second part. They're just thinking about, I'm done and this is how I'm going to do it, and that's it. So to first jam the cell door, to make sure that the corrections officers couldn't reach him or had trouble reaching him, or to revive him. And then when they found him, they said they tried life-saving techniques. I heard from sources that they wanted to get him out of there anyway. They brought him to Leominster Hospital. It's just an easier way than have all the inmates or anybody see his body being taken out of the prison like that. So they wanted to make sure, they say that they tried life-saving techniques. Sources say that they were going to, they wanted to get him out of there. They brought him to the hospital. And as you mentioned, that's where he was pronounced dead.
All right, 7, Steve Cooper on the phone with us right now, talking a little bit more about the Sousa Baranowski Correction Center, a maximum security center with, I think, about 1,000 prisoners there currently, or at least has the capacity to house that many. So it's 7:47 here on this Wednesday morning, and if you're just tuning in for the news of the day, we do have some major breaking news that we've been following all morning long, and that is the death of Aaron Hernandez behind bars. This is believed to be a suicide, according to Department of Corrections officials. They said that he hanged himself apparently in his cell, and he was discovered around 3:05 this morning, was then taken to a hospital in Leominster after the crew there tried to perform life-saving techniques on him. And he was later pronounced dead around 4 o'clock this morning at that hospital by a physician, apparently using a bed sheet and attaching that to his cell window. There were also, according to this report, attempts to block his door from the inside, that he was jamming the door, had jammed the door with several items. They didn't specify what exactly. So we do know, as Steve was mentioning, that Massachusetts police are on the scene. They're investigating, and that Mr. Hernandez's next of kin have been notified. One would think that would include his mother, Terry, who was in court with him during his first murder trial, during the Odin Lloyd case, other cousins, his fiancée, who is also the mother of his 4-year-old daughter. And Steve was kind of going into the differences that we've seen in Aaron Hernandez during the course of the last couple of trials. This, instance where he broke down and was crying during the reading of the verdict, and kind of seeming inconsistent, but perhaps pointing to some turbulence that was boiling underneath the surface.
And one thing you never know is somebody's mental health. How they appear, you never know what they're thinking, how they're feeling. It's something we've never heard about. As far as we know, according to Steve, he was not on a suicide watch while he was in Shirley, while he was spending time awaiting trial for the murder of Odin Lloyd. Sheriff Hodgson there said he appeared to fit in to life in prison. Obviously, he was convicted of the murder of Odin Lloyd. He was sentenced to prison, but news of the suicide comes just 5 days after he was acquitted of a double murder where, again, when the verdict was read, you could see him break down. So you have to wonder what was going through his mind. Was it prison that was getting to him? Was it all of this? You know, as Steve said, did he just have a conversation with someone in his family over the Easter holiday? You know, right. These are things we just don't know that, you know, may come to light in the coming days. Right now, we want to head out to 7's Jonathan Hall, who joins us on the phone with more in reaction of Hernandez's death.
Well, good morning, Nicole and Krista. Like so many in Massachusetts, I woke to this shocking news. Here's a guy, Aaron Hernandez, who was so calm and collected, certainly on the football field and most of the time in court, and yet he is a man full of surprises with possibly killing 3 people, although he was acquitted of the first 2 murders, the D'Abreu and Furtado murders. And then to kill himself just a few days after this great victory in Suffolk Superior Court. It's just an absolute shock, certainly to me, and certainly I'm sure to his former teammates who are now headed to the White House, and pretty much everybody. I mean, who saw this coming? I would say that they say suicide is a supremely selfish act. And he did this on the day that his former teammates, Tom Brady, Rob Gronkowski, are headed to the White House to meet with President Trump and kind of soak in some of the glory from that Super Bowl win down in Houston. So it's a stunning development. I don't think I can say I saw this coming, and I'm not sure anybody did. I covered the whole Whitey Bulger trial. If you would have told me that Mr. Bulger in his 80s would outlive Aaron Hernandez, another convicted killer, well, I would have said you were crazy. So it's really stunning news, that's for sure, here in Massachusetts, and it's making national news from coast to coast. I would wonder what the emotions are of the families of Odin Lloyd, of Furtado D'Abreu. You know, they just had this defeat in court a few days ago. And now the man that they believe killed their loved ones is dead himself, hanging from a bedsheet. Stunning news, to be sure.
John, thank you so much. So again, to recap, according to Steve Cooper, Mass State Police are both at the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Facility in Shirley. They were also at the hospital, UMass Leominster, where Aaron Hernandez was rushed to in an attempt to save his life. But again, according to the Department of Corrections, he was found dead at 3:05 a.m. inside of his jail cell. It was a single cell. He was in general population. He was pronounced dead just an hour later. According to DOC, they said that Hernandez attempted to jam his door shut using various items. One thing, obviously, that state police are going to look into is the last time that Hernandez was checked on, his demeanor throughout the day leading up to this.
Right, exactly. What kind of state of mind was he in? Was there a flip that was switched? We already know that he had somewhat of a compromised profile to begin with. I mean, that even came to light during the trial when one of the witnesses testified that Hernandez felt that he was being tried and tested all the time by various people. The first trial that we saw, there were some strains of paranoia.
Yes.
He thought he was being surveilled as well. So clearly what we saw here was inconsistent with kind of the stoic Aaron Hernandez that we've seen, but there were certainly a lot of signs pointing to a man with a clearly troubled past.
And right now, 7's Trey Dare joins us on the phone. And Trey, we were just talking about someone who was signed to a multi-million-dollar deal with a championship team with the Patriots. And we were just talking about what went wrong.
Yeah, guys, certainly almost exclusively, whenever you think of Aaron Hernandez, you're only going to remember what's happened to you in the better part of the last 3 years, and obviously for very good reason. But it's it's almost easy to forget how good he was on the football field and how all of this stuff has overshadowed his talent and how in a way he and Rob Gronkowski together were kind of changing the way the tight ends are used in the NFL and more in particular two tight ends together. And a guy that had so much future and obviously just made a couple very wrong decisions that put him in a very bad spot. And then obviously today ending in tragedy and really just closing the chapter on, or hopefully in some regards, closing the chapter on what goes down as a very bizarre era for the Patriots, just bringing him in. He was a player with question marks and then further with all that they had to deal with. And again, all that happened 3 years ago was a very, very, very strange time and how it unfolded. And who will really forget, Robert Kraft having to get up on the stand. It was so unique of a situation to see in all regards. And now for it to end like this, I'm sure a lot of people really didn't see this coming. I can't imagine too many people that really can say they did. Obviously we were aware of some of the tattoos that he had and maybe there were some cryptic messages within there, or certainly there would be believed to be some cryptic messages in there. You have to feel for the families involved. I'm sure that those who were most affected by this tragedy were affected, and as well as the Hernandez family itself. But this is a guy whose legacy certainly on the field is always going to be remembered as what could have been. What could have been if he could have somehow kept his act clean. He could have went down as probably pretty safe to say one of the 10 best tight ends in NFL history. He had that kind of talent. He was used that way, and sadly today it all comes to an end.
You had mentioned as well, I remember that very clearly when Robert Kraft had to testify during that first trial, and he looked really, really uncomfortable there and seemed like, what he was saying pointed to Aaron Hernandez lying to his bosses about what happened. And we were talking on the phone earlier with Steve Diassi, who had played with the Patriots a few years back in the 90s. He was just talking about how guys on the team, they have kind of an unorganized effort, but they do try to help out teammates who are in trouble.
That said, I think that the best way to describe the Kraft thing or all of this around the team was just really created an uncomfortable situation. I don't think there's any way to understate that. Some of the visuals of, him being dragged out of his house and, him running into the facility is all this was going down. You hear these guys talk a lot on the field about being brothers, but man, it's just really hard for them to speak of this thing. And then, you almost wonder if somehow what was going on today ties into his decision. I mean, we put all politics aside with what's going on as we understand that, probably quite a few Patriots, more than a handful, will not even be going today. But despite all that, you forget that. This is a chance for a team to shake hands with the President of the United States, no matter who it is, stand on the White House lawn. They won 2 Super Bowl rings without this guy in the last 3 years that he was there. You wonder how much realization is in his mind about how great this team is and how wonderful the accomplishments are. And he never got to sniff it. Not even close because of some of the monumental mistakes that he was forced to deal with. So it's just so strange to hear the Patriots, and we hear all the time about the Patriot way, and here was a guy that just could not have further been disassociated with the Patriot way and keeping your nose clean and staying out of the limelight. He found himself entrenched in what clearly goes down as one of the strangest and most talked about and violent stories in the NFL in the last 10 years. And that's always going to be his legacy. And it's a shame now that his players are going to have to hear about this, or a lot of his former teammates, I should say, on a day that, they should remember for the rest of their lives. As we said, putting politics aside, this now is going to probably overshadow their day on the Rose Garden. And that's a little bit of a shame.
Yeah, Trey mentioned, the Patriot way. During that testimony with Kraft, what he had said was He had heard that there was an incident. He went to Hernandez and asked him if he was involved. Right. And then, you know, Kraft had said that he considered Hernandez part of his extended family and that he wanted to be able to get him help. And, you know, earlier this morning we spoke to former Patriots linebacker Steve Diassi, and one thing he had mentioned was, you know, sometimes these players have troubled upbringings. Some can break away from that, and some are able to do that with the help of the organization. Diassi saying that Hernandez was someone who appeared he couldn't break away.
There were signs, but I don't think no matter what signs that you have, I don't think anybody could extrapolate murder out of those signs. It was one of those things where it was just craziness all around. Once that person's in the team scenario, there's not a lot teams can do other than try to offer him scenarios that could get him help. You can't force a guy to get help. You can't mandate it. You can't really put it in the contract that someone's going to seek help for various types of behavior. But I think teams are going to do a combination of trying to avoid having those guys on the team and to offer up whatever counseling or whatever services the NFL and the teams have to offer.
All right, and that was Steve Diassi, a former player for the Patriots in the 1990s, and was talking to us a little bit about kind of the consolidated effort that goes into helping a player who's in trouble on the team. So it's 8 o'clock here on this Wednesday morning, and if you're just tuning in for 7 News today in New England, we are covering some extended breaking news, and we're doing so all morning long here for you. Aaron Hernandez found dead inside of his prison cell.